The list sat on Silas Croft's desk, crisp as a new dollar, and the names on it were a record of the town's respect. Elspeth Hale looked at it, then at the man whose face was a thundercloud of curdled pride. His fingers, usually so quick to count coin, were still. Outside, the August sun beat down on the dusty street, and the whole of Prosperity Wells seemed to be holding its breath, waiting. On the counter between them sat a single jar of peach preserves, its contents the color of a captured sunset. It was the last jar she had, and the first he had ever truly seen. One person alone, he had said, could never turn ruin into riches. He had not yet understood that the arithmetic of hope is different from the arithmetic of greed. For months earlier, the town had agreed with him. For months earlier, Elspeth Hale had knelt in the back of a wagon, her hands buried in what everyone called trash, and the whole town knew she had finally lost her mind. It had been a Tuesday in late April, a day of such punishing wind that it scoured the paint from the sides of buildings and drove dust into the cracks of every soul. The wagons from the southern orchards had just arrived, their beds full of the season's first peaches, but the news had arrived before them, sour and unwelcome. A freak hailstorm, the size of marbles and then fists, had torn through the groves the night before. Silas Croft, who ran the mercantile and considered the town's appetite his personal property, stood on the boardwalk with his hands on his hips, surveying the damage. The peaches were not rotten, not yet, but they were savaged. Each one bore the pockmarks and split skins of the storm, ugly wounds that would weep sugar and turn to brown rot within days. They were unsellable for eating and too damaged for the careful. Pretty preserves the town wives put up for the church bazaar. Croft made a show of it, picking one up and turning it over with a look of theatrical disgust. "Pig feed," he declared, his voice carrying over the wind. "That's all this is fit for. A total loss." The farmers looked at the ground, their year's work bleeding out onto the wagon bed. The townsfolk who had gathered murmured in sympathy, but also in relief that it wasn't their loss. Elspeth Hale stood at the back of the crowd. She had been in town for her weekly supplies, a list so short it was hardly worth the walk. Since her husband's passing the year before, she had become a ghost in the town's vision, a quiet figure of pity. A young woman alone, they'd say, with nothing but a hard-luck quarter section of sun-baked clay her husband had thought he could tame. They expected her to fail, to pack up and go back to whatever family she had. But Elspeth had a kind of stubbornness that grew best in poor soil. She watched Croft's performance, but her eyes were on the peaches. She saw the bruises, the torn skins, the weeping juice. But she also saw the color beneath the wounds, a deep, arterial blush that spoke of a good son and a sweet heart. She had learned from her grandmother that damage was not the same as ruin. She waited until the crowd dispersed, until Croft was preparing to send the farmers away with pennies for their trouble to haul the load to the hog farms. She stepped forward, her shadow falling over the crate nearest the tailgate. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice quiet but clear. He turned, surprised to see her. "Elspeth, a sad sight, isn't it? What will you do with them?" she asked, her gaze fixed on the fruit. "Do with them?" He laughed, a short, barking sound. "Like I said, beak feet. Can't put this on my shelves. People want perfect. They pay for perfect. I'll take a crate," she said. The words hung in the air, small and strange. Croft stared at her. The farmer, a man with tired lines around his eyes, looked up with a flicker of interest. "A crate?" Croft said, his voice dripping with condescending concern. "Child, what would you do with a crate of this?" "It'll be mold by morning. I'll take one," she repeated, her chin lifting just a fraction. "How much?" Croft's eyes narrowed. He saw the threadbare cuffs of her dress, the careful patches on her elbows. He saw a fool to be fleeced, or perhaps just a spectacle to be enjoyed. $3, he said, naming a price that was both an insult and a highway robbery for spoiled fruit. It was more than she spent on flour and salt in a month. It was a dare. The town held its breath. They saw a desperate woman making a desperate wager. But Elspeth was not desperate. She was observant. She had 50 cents left from her egg money after buying her supplies. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the 2 quarters, polished from worry. Then she unpinned a small, silver locket from the collar of her dress. It had been her mother's. It was the only thing of value she had left. She placed the coins and the locket on the edge of the wagon bed. "This and my credit for the rest," she said. "I'll work it off." Silas Croft looked at the locket, then at her face. A slow, cruel smile spread across his lips. He was not a man who understood value, only price. He picked up the locket and pocketed it. "Fine," he said, loud enough for the lingering gossips to hear. "Let me know I'm helping the widow Hale. But don't come crying to me when you're feeding it all to the crows." The farmer, with a look that was half pity and half gratitude, helped her load the heavy wooden crate into her small handcart. As she began the long, dusty walk home, the whispers followed her like burrs. Lost her senses, grief does strange things, $3 for rot. She didn't look back. She kept her eyes on the path ahead, her hands tight on the cart's handle. She could already smell them. Not the cloying scent of decay, but the deep, wild sweetness of a thing that had been broken open. On the edge of town, she passed the small, tidy cottage of Anya Petrova. The old woman was in her garden, her back bent over a row of cabbages. She looked up as Elspeth approached, her eyes, pale as a winter sky, taking in the cart and its cargo. She said nothing, merely watched. Elspeth paused, the weight of the town's judgment heavy on her shoulders. Anya straightened up, wiping her hands on her apron. She walked to her fence. "They laugh," Anya said. It was not a question. Her voice was thick with the accent of a country long left behind. "Yes," Elspeth said. Anya reached a wrinkled hand over the fence and picked up one of the most damaged peaches. She turned it in her palm, her thumb tracing the edge of a deep, star-shaped split. "In my country," she said softly, "we know a thing. The wound is where the sweetness enters. The sun, it cannot get in so deep on a perfect skin." She met Elspeth's eyes, and for the first time that day, Elspeth felt seen, not pitted. "You go," Anya said, nodding toward the road. "You work. Do not listen to the noise of fools who have never been hungry." Elspeth nodded, a lump forming in her throat. She pulled the cart, and the weight felt different now. It felt less like a burden and more like a promise. The work began before the sun was fully down. She hauled the crate into her small, clean kitchen, the sweet, fermenting scent filling the single room. It was a race against the rot. She lit every lamp she owned, the yellow light pushing back the shadows and her own creeping doubt. One person alone. The phrase echoed in her mind. It was meant to be a sentence, a condemnation of her state. But as she laid the first bruised peach on her cutting board, it began to feel like something else. A starting point. She worked with a fierce, methodical grace. Her first task was triage. She sorted the peaches into 3 piles. The first, the merely bruised with skins intact. The second, the split and weeping where the damage was clean. The third, the truly crushed, those with the telltale brown, softening of decay already setting in. This last pile she worked on first, her knife flashing. She was a surgeon of the harvest, cutting away every hint of brown, salvaging the good, golden flesh that remained. Nothing was wasted. The unsalvageable bits went into a bucket for the compost heap. The good flesh went into her largest pot. It was a slow, sticky business. Her hands were soon slick with juice, her arms aching. The arithmetic began in her head, a quiet, constant hum beneath the sound of the knife. 1 crate, perhaps 60 pounds of fruit. If she lost a third to rot, that left 40 pounds. 40 pounds of flesh. How much sugar would that take? She had a small sack, painstakingly saved. It would not be enough. How many jars? She had 2 dozen collected and washed over the year. It would not be enough. The numbers were stark and unforgiving. The town was right. This was a fool's errand. She stopped, her knife resting on the board. The silence of the small house pressed in on her. Outside, the prairie night was vast and indifferent. It would be so easy to give up, to tip the whole mess into the yard and admit defeat. She could go to Mr. Croft tomorrow, head bowed, and arrange to work off her foolish debt. She closed her eyes and saw his smug, satisfied face. Then she saw Anya Petrova's, her steady gaze over the fence. The wound is where the sweetness enters. She picked up the knife. The work was the only answer to the doubt. She would solve the problems as they came. First, the fruit, then the rest. As she worked into the deep hours of the night, a small sound at her screen door made her jump. A boy stood there, a silhouette against the moonlight. It was Leo, a thin, watchful child of about 10 who lived in a tumble-down shack with a father who was rarely sober and never kind. He was known for being everywhere and nowhere, a piece of the town's scenery that most people looked right through. He said nothing, just watch her hands moving in the lamplight. "What is it, Leo?" she asked gently. "Smelled it," he mumbled, his eyes fixed on the growing mountain of cut peaches. "It's just spoiled fruit," she said, echoing the town's verdict. "No, it ain't," he said, with the simple certainty of a child. "It smells like summer." Elspeth looked at the boy, at his worn shirt, and the hunger in his eyes that wasn't just for food. She thought of her own solitary quiet. "Can you pit?" she asked. He nodded. She opened the door and gestured to a stool. She showed him how to use the small spoon to flick the stones out of the halved peaches, his small, deft fingers quickly learning the rhythm. They worked in a comfortable silence. The only sounds the soft thud of the pits into a bowl and the whisper of the knife. He did not ask what she was doing or why. He simply worked, his presence a quiet anchor in the lonely night. By dawn, every usable piece of fruit had been cut, pitted, and sorted. The kitchen was a glorious, sticky mess, but it was a mess of potential. Elspeth sent Leo home with 2 of the less bruised peaches in his pockets, a secret between them. As he left, he turned back. "What are you going to call it?" he asked. "Call what?" "The jam," he said. Elspeth hadn't even thought that far. She looked at the pots of golden fruit, macerating in their own juice. The hailstones had been the beginning of it all. "Hailstone gold," she said, the name coming to her in a rush. Leo smiled, a rare, bright thing. "I like it," he said, and disappeared into the gray morning light. The next problem was sugar. Her small sack was gone, used to coat the cut fruit to draw out the juices and keep it from browning. It was barely a quarter of what she needed. Sugar was expensive, a luxury. It was sold by Silas Croft. Walking back into the mercantile was an act of supreme will. She could feel the weight of his victory before she even opened the door. He was behind the counter, polishing a glass jar, a smug look on his face. Well, he said as she entered. "Come to admit your mistake? Don't worry, I'll be generous. A month's sweeping should clear your debt for the locket." A few customers lingered, their ears perked. This was the next act of the tragic play they'd all been watching. "I need sugar, Mr. Croft," Elspeth said, her voice even. "A 20-pound sack." A hush fell over the store. 20 pounds was a baker's quantity, a preserver's ransom. Croft's smirk widened. "Sugar," he said, leaning on the counter. "Decided to bury the taste of rot. Have we?" "That's a bold strategy." He named a price that was a full 10 cents a pound higher than the usual rate. It was punitive. It was a tax on her foolishness. "On my account," she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. Her account was already in debt for the peaches. This would bury her deeper, make her beholden to him for the rest of the year, maybe longer. It was exactly what he wanted. He wanted to own her failure. "As you wish," he said, his voice smooth as syrup. He made a show of weighing out the bag, of marking the new, larger debt in his ledger with a flourish. As she lifted the heavy sack, he added, "You'll be sweeping my floors till Christmas." Elspeth, she did not reply. Being right is its own kind of reply, and she was not there yet. She hauled the sack home, her back screaming in protest, but her mind was already on the next step of the arithmetic. The jars. She had 2 dozen. She needed at least 100. She spent the next day walking. She went to the far edges of the county, to homesteads abandoned after drought or heartbreak. She searched in collapsed root cellars and forgotten pantries, her hands sifting through dirt and debris. In the remains of the old Miller place, she found a dusty crate with 15 good jars, their metal lids rusted but salvageable. At a collapsed soddy near the creek bed, she found 10 more, cloudy with grime. She carried them home, wrapped in her apron, precious as jewels. She scrubbed them with sand and lye soap until they gleamed, their clarity a promise of the treasure they would soon hold. Leo appeared again that evening, his pockets empty. He wordlessly took up the task of scouring the rusted lids with a wire brush, his small hands patient and thorough. Together, they prepared for the boiling. The process took 3 days. Her small house became a steam bath, the windows fogged, the air thick with the scent of simmering peaches, cinnamon, and a hint of lemon she'd squeezed from 2 precious, hoarded fruits. It was an alchemical process, transforming bruised flesh into a shimmering, translucent gold. She skimmed the foam from the top of the bubbling mixture, her arms steady. She taught Leo how to test for the set, dripping a small bead of the hot liquid onto a chilled plate. They watched together as it wrinkled, holding its shape. It had worked. The first batch was ready. They filled the hot, sterilized jars one by one, a silent, reverent production line. Elspeth ladled the molten gold. Leo wiped the rims, and Elspeth sealed them tight. They set them on the porch to cool, the setting sun glinting off the glass. As each jar cooled, the lid made a soft, satisfying pop, a sound of completion, of safety, of food secured against the coming cold. It was the most beautiful sound she had ever heard. By the end of the 3rd day, they had 117 jars. 117 small suns lined up on her shelves, glowing in the dim light of the cabin. They were beautiful, they were perfect, and they were secret. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that the town was not ready to see them. It is easier to believe a thing is rotten than to admit you were wrong to mock it. So she kept her success banked low, like a coal under ash, waiting for the right moment to let it glow. She gave 1 jar to Leo, who held it like it was the deed to the whole world. She wrapped another in a clean cloth and took it to Anya Petrova. The old woman accepted it without a word. She opened it, dipped a spoon inside, and tasted it. She closed her eyes for a long moment. When she opened them, they were shining. "This is not jam," she said, her voice full of a strange reverence. "This is memory of a son. You have not saved the fruit. You have saved the summer." She looked at Elspeth, a real smile touching her lips. "Now," she said, "you wait. A thing of worth knows its own time." Elspeth waited. The town of Prosperity Wells moved on. The story of the widow and her rotten peaches became a cautionary tale, a piece of local folklore told with a shake of the head. Silas Croft was particularly fond of telling it, embellishing the details of her foolishness to his customers. He'd check his ledger, tapping the page with Elspeth's name on it. "Still owes me for the sugar to sweeten her failure," he'd say with a chuckle. Elspeth ignored it all. She worked her small plot, tending the stubborn vegetables that grew in the clay soil. She sold her eggs, and every week she went to the mercantile and paid a small amount against her debt, never saying a word about the treasure hidden in her pantry. She was biding her time, listening to the rhythm of the seasons, and doing her arithmetic. 117 jars. Subtract 2 given away. 115. Cost of peaches, $3 and a locket. Cost of sugar, a crushing debt. Cost of jars, 3 days of scavenging. Cost of labor, her own aching back and sleepless nights. The numbers told a story of risk, but she was beginning to feel the shape of the reward. July slid into August, hot and breathless. The town's own peach trees, the ones in backyard gardens and small orchards, were heavy with green, promising fruit. The women of the town began to talk of canning, of the church bazaar, of stocking their pantries. Their peaches were perfect, unblemished globes. They would make pale, respectable preserves. They looked at Elspeth, tilling her dusty garden, and felt a familiar pang of pity. That poor woman, with her jars of spoiled mush. They had no idea that a reckoning was on its way, carried on the humid evening air. The first sign was a faint, silvery powder on the underside of a peach leaf, then a brown spot on a perfect green fruit. A farmer brought a branch into Croft's mercantile, his face grim. "It's the blight," he said. "The damp heat brought it on. It's moving fast." Croft, whose entire late summer profit depended on buying local produce cheap and selling it dear, scoffed. "It's a touch of mildew. A dry spell will clear it right up." But the dry spell did not come. Instead, a week of close, sticky nights, and damp dawns settled over the valley. The blight spread like a rumor, then like a fire. It moved from tree to tree, from orchard to orchard. The promising green peaches stopped growing. They developed soft, gray spots that quickly consumed the whole fruit, turning it into a foul-smelling, withered husk. The town's women watched in horror as their own backyard tree succumbed. The crop was not just damaged, it was gone. An entire season's worth of sweetness, wiped out in a matter of weeks. Panic began to set in. Winter on the prairie was long and hard. Preserves were not a luxury. They were a necessity, a source of fruit and sugar to get through the lean months. And this year, there would be none. The shelves of the mercantile, which should have been groaning with crates of local peaches, were empty. Silas Croft's face grew tighter with each passing day. He had orders from hotels and restaurants in the city, orders he could not fill. His suppliers from the south had their own blight problems. Peaches were suddenly scarce, and therefore precious. The price of a single, perfect peach, if one could be found, quadrupled overnight. And the price of a jar of preserves became a subject of frantic speculation. It was in the midst of this growing panic that a stranger's wagon threw a wheel just outside Elspeth's property. He was a cook, he explained, from a grand hotel in the capital, on his way to see about sourcing produce. He was a large man with a cheerful face and hands that knew their way around a kitchen. Elspeth offered him water for his horse and a place to sit in the shade while he worked on the repair. As a gesture of hospitality, she brought him a biscuit and a small dish of her preserves. He thanked her absently, his mind on his broken axle. He took a bite of the biscuit, and then he froze. His eyes widened. He looked from the biscuit to the dish of glistening amber preserves. He took another, slower bite. He savored it, his professional focus absolute. "My word," he said, his voice hushed. He looked at Elspeth, truly seeing her for the first time. "Where did you get this?" "I made it," she said simply. "You made this?" He dipped his finger in the dish and tasted it plain. The depth of flavor, it's not just sweet. It's roasted, caramelized. There's a note in here I've never tasted in a peach preserve. Elspeth thought of the hail-split skins, the way the sun had baked the sugars into the wounded flesh before she'd even put it in a pot. The wound is where the sweetness enters. "It's a family recipe," she said. The cook stood up, his broken wagon forgotten. "Ma'am, I'll buy every jar of this you have. Name your price. The hotel will pay it. Our clientele, they would go mad for this." He saw the rows of jars through her open kitchen door, 100 suns in the gloom. His eyes gleamed with the thrill of discovery. It was the moment she had waited for, the validation from the outside world, the proof. But she looked past him toward the dusty road that led to town, to the people who had mocked her. She thought of their empty pantries and their blighted trees. She thought of Leo and of Anya Petrova. The arithmetic in her head was no longer just about her own survival. It was about the town. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "It's not for sale." "Not to you." The cook stared at her, flabbergasted. "Not for sale? Ma'am, you don't understand. I will pay you a fortune. I have debts to settle at home first," she said. He left an hour later, his wheel fixed, his mind still reeling from the preserve he couldn't buy. But the story did not leave with him. It traveled into town on the back of a farmer's wagon who'd stopped to help with the wheel. A city cook, offering a fortune for the Widow Hale's spoiled peach jam. The news rippled through Prosperity Wells, changing shape with each telling. A fortune for the rotten peaches. It didn't make sense, but the blight made a terrifying kind of sense. And their own shelves were bare. The mockery that had followed Elspeth for months curdled into a new, complex emotion, a mix of disbelief, envy, and a dawning, desperate hope. The town began to watch her again, but this time their stares were not filled with pity. They were filled with calculation. Silas Croft heard the story, and a cold knot of fury and avarice tightened in his gut. Her preserves, the ones made from his pig feed, with his sugar, bought on a debt he owned. He owned her, he reasoned. Therefore, he owned her success. He did not wait. He rode his buggy out to her small homestead that very evening, a cloud of dust billowing behind him. He found her on the porch, mending a shirt in the fading light. Leo sat on the steps, whittling a piece of wood. Croft didn't bother with pleasantries. He strode up to the porch as if he owned it. "Elspeth," he began, his voice oozing a false, paternal warmth that was far more menacing than his usual scorn. "I've heard the most remarkable story. It seems your little experiment was a success after all. I must admit, I am surprised, and very pleased for you." Elspeth kept her eyes on her sewing, her needle moving in and out of the worn fabric with a steady rhythm. "It is good jam," she said. "Good." Croft laughed. "My dear girl, I hear it's a miracle, and I am here to help you with it. A young woman alone, you can't possibly manage an inventory of, what is it, 100 jars?" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. 115, isn't it? It was a slip, a fatal one. She had never told anyone the count. Only Leo knew, and he was silent as a stone. Only someone who had been spying on her, counting the jars on her shelves through the window at night, would know the exact number. She stopped sewing. She looked up and met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw not a pitiful widow, but a woman made of prairie steel. "How did you know the count, Mr. Croft?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. He faltered for a second, a flicker of panic in his eyes. "Well, the cook, he must have mentioned it," he blustered. But they both knew the cook had never gotten close enough to count. "I am here to make you a generous offer," he pressed on, trying to regain control. "I will buy the entire lot, all 115 jars. I'll give you 50 cents a jar. That's $57.50. Enough to clear your debt and leave you with a handsome profit. I'll take them off your hands, handle all the trouble of selling them. It's the best deal you'll get." It was, she knew, a tenth of what they were worth, perhaps a 20th. He intended to sell them in the city for $10 a jar, maybe more. He was offering her scraps from the fortune he would build on her work, her insight, her sleepless nights. He was offering to buy her summer for the price of a decent winter coat. She stood up, folding her mending with deliberate care. Leo watched, his hand resting on a half-carved bird. "No, thank you, Mr. Croft," she said. His face hardened, the false warmth vanishing. "Don't be a fool, Elspeth. This is a one-time offer. You have no way to move this kind of product. The town has no money. Take my deal, or you'll be sitting on these jars until they rot on the shelves." "They will not rot," she said. "They are preserved." The simple truth of the statement seemed to enrage him. "I own your debt," he snarled, his voice rising. "You used my sugar. In a way, this is my property. You will be paid what you are owed, Mr. Croft," she said. "Every penny. But you will not have my preserves." He stared at her, his face flushed with anger. He saw he had lost, that his threats and his condescension were useless against the quiet wall of her resolve. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You'll come begging to me when winter comes." He stormed back to his buggy, leaving a thick silence in his wake. Leo looked up at Elspeth, his eyes wide. "What are you going to do?" he asked. Elspeth looked out at the darkening prairie, the first stars beginning to appear. "Tomorrow," she said, "is market day." The next morning, Elspeth and Leo loaded 90 of the jars into the handcart. They wrapped each one in cloth to protect it on the journey. The cart was heavy, a burden of hope. When they arrived at the town square, the market was a subdued, anxious place. The usual tables of produce were sparse, the mood grim. Elspeth pushed her cart to the center of the square, to the spot right in front of the mercantile's grand entrance. She and Leo began to unload the jars, setting them up in neat, gleaming rows on a small table she'd brought. A crowd began to gather. They came in ones and twos, drawn by a force they couldn't name. They were her neighbors, the people who had whispered and pitted and laughed. They were the women with empty pantries, the men with worried faces. They stared at the jars of hailstone gold, their color rich and deep in the morning sun. They looked like jewels. Silas Croft came out onto the boardwalk of his store, his arms crossed, a thunderous look on his face. He was waiting for her to fail. He was certain she would. Elspeth let the silence build. She let them look. Then she took one jar, held it up to the light, and spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it carried in the still air. "This is hailstone gold preserve," she said. "It is made from the peaches you all saw in April. The hail split peaches. A murmur went through the crowd. The blight has taken the harvest, she continued, her voice steady and clear. I know many of you have nothing put away for the winter. Mr. Croft has offered to buy my entire stock to sell in the city. But these preserves were made here. They belong here. She looked directly at Croft, who flinched as if struck. Then her gaze swept over the faces of her neighbors. She began the arithmetic out loud for all to hear. A crate of peaches cost me $3 and a locket I can never replace. The sugar from Mr. Croft's store, for which I am in debt, cost $22. The jars I salvaged, the wood I burned, the 3 days I spent sleepless at the stove. My labor has a value. She paused, letting the words sink in. Mr. Croft offered me 50 cents a jar. He would sell them for 20 times that. That is the arithmetic of greed. The crowd was silent, their eyes moving from her face to Croft's. My price is $2 a jar, she announced. A gasp went through the crowd. It was a high price, more than anyone had ever paid for preserves. But it was not a fortune. It was not a gouging. It was, they all knew deep down, fair. With that, she said, her voice ringing with a newfound authority, I can pay my debt to Mr. Croft in full. I can buy my locket back if you will sell it. I can purchase sugar and flour for the winter. And I can begin again next year. She looked at them. This is not the arithmetic of greed. This is the arithmetic of survival. It is a fair price. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, a woman at the front, Mrs. Gable, whose husband had been one of the loudest mockers, stepped forward. She held $2 coins in her outstretched hand. I'll take one, Elspeth, she said, her voice thick with emotion. And I am sorry for what was said. That broke the dam. The townsfolk surged forward, not in a crush, but in an orderly, respectful line. They had money saved for canning that they now would not need. They held out their dollars, and Elspeth and Leo handed them the heavy, precious jars. A woman named Sarah, a proud, frightened widow like herself, reached the front of the line and confessed in a whisper she only had $1. Elspeth quietly took the dollar and gave her a jar anyway, a silent acknowledgement of their shared struggle. Elspeth sold 85 jars in less than an hour. She counted the money, stacked the coins in neat piles on her table. $170. It was more money than she had ever held in her life. She walked across the dust to the mercantile, the coins heavy in a cloth bag. She entered the store, which was now empty. Silas Croft stood behind his counter, his face pale. She counted out $22 and placed it on the counter. My debt for the sugar is paid, she said. Then she counted out another $3. And this is for the peaches. She paused. I would like to buy back my mother's locket. Croft looked at the pile of money, then at her. The entire town was watching through the windows. His power, built on their debts and his control of goods, had evaporated in a single morning. He reached into his waistcoat pocket and pulled out the small, silver locket. He slid it across the counter without a word. Elspeth picked it up, its familiar weight a comfort in her palm. She pinned it back in its place at her collar. She had paid her debts. She was free. She turned and walked out of the store, back into the sunlight, leaving Silas Croft alone with his empty shelves and his worthless arithmetic. The 5 jars she had not sold, she kept. One for herself, one for Leo, one for Anya Petrova. The last 2 she set aside. That evening, as the sun set, Anya and Leo joined her on her porch. The air was cooling, carrying the first hint of autumn. They ate biscuits with hailstone gold, the taste of summer that had been saved from ruin. Anya looked at the jars, still glowing on the pantry shelf. You see, she said, her voice soft. The wound let the sweetness in. But it was your hands that saved it. Elspeth looked out at her small piece of land, at the town in the distance. No longer a place of judgment, but a community she had, against all odds, fed. She was no longer Elspeth Hale, the poor widow. She was the woman who had found gold in what was broken. She was a person alone, yes, but she had learned that was not a sentence. It was just the beginning of the sum. And for the first time in a long time, her own accounts felt balanced. The arithmetic of her life finally, thankfully, added up.